Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. I do hope you are feeling very well. May I apologise for my lengthy absence. I've had an extraordinary workload on of late and a little bit ill as well during the month, but I'm back. And in this episode we're looking at 6 modern classics that I got in a book haul from my favourite second-hand bookseller. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? The first classic book that we've got in this haul is none other than All the Names by Jose Saramago. Now, Saramago he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's probably more well known for his classic book Blindness, which is one of the most riveting plots you'll ever read. But this book follows an obscure, innocuous character called Senor Jose, who works in the city registry office in a Portuguese town. And he's surrounded by stacks and stacks of filing cabinets, you know, the old wooden ones that you pull in and out. He's got all the registry cards of births and deaths for everyone in the city. Now, in the daytime he works his way through that, but at night time, he privately collects his own sort of records of famous and important people. He takes their details and writes them down to make his own little database. But while he's going through the registry cards this one time, he comes across an insignificant card of an ordinary woman who shouldn't appeal in any way, but catches his interest. And he begins to dwell on the details of this woman, and then starts a journey where he tries to take clues to track her down, to find her, so that he can save her from a fate worse than oblivion. Now, how interesting does that sound? It's sort of at once profound and trivial. It's a very out of left field approach to an insightful look at life and the glory of the mundane, if that makes any sense. A real unusual angle to take on a book. And there's one thing I do want to show you. Part of the design of the book, if you're aware of sort of literature forms, one of the things people play with is the typography of a book. I don't mean the fonts, but actually the structure of how it's all set out. Now look at this. Pretty much wherever I open the book, I don't know if you can see this. I'll try and hold it even closer. Don't know if that's focused. It's solid. It's like a solid paragraph. The end of paragraphs, it takes pages for one paragraph to finish. And that adds to the sort of claustrophobic, high detail environment that Senor Jose fits in of a registry office. It's just this mass of writing. It's like it's the mind of Senor Jose. And that in itself is a very clever piece of writing itself. But it does make it sometimes a little bit hard to get into because it's dense in that respect. But have you read anything by Saramago? Leave a comment down below if you have, and tell me what you think of him. So that was number 1, All the Names by Jose Saramago. I'll just read the opening to this book. Above the doorframe is a long, narrow plaque in enamelled metal. The black letters set against a white background say Central Registry of Births, Marriages and Deaths. Here and there the enamel is cracked and chipped. The door is an old door. The most recent layer of brown paint is beginning to peel, and the exposed grain of the wood is reminiscent of a striped pelt. There are 5 windows along the facade. As soon as you cross the threshold, you notice the smell of old paper. It's true that not a day passes without new pieces of paper entering the registry, papers referring to individuals of the male sex and of the female sex, who continue to be born in the outside world, but the smell never changes. Firstly, because the fate of all paper, from the moment it leaves the factory, is to begin to grow old. Secondly, because on the older pieces of paper, but often on the new paper too, not a day passes without someone inscribing it with the causes of death and the respective places and dates, each fact contributing its own particular smells, not always offensive to the olfactory mucous membrane, a case in point being the aromatic effluvia which from time to time waft lightly through the central registry, and which the more discriminating noses identify as a perfume that is half rose and half chrysanthemum. Now I personally think that's a brilliant description of atmosphere, and particularly if I've noticed this with reading the classics, if you really want to get something that sort of embalms you in the atmosphere, embalms you in the moment, evoke the sense of smell. The smell is linked to the amygdala in the brain, which is also the memory centre of the brain. And I think when you invoke the sense of smell in your description, it will take the reader to a memory of their own and make it easier to depict the scene that you're describing. So that was just absolutely brilliant. Next up in our book haul is a prequel classic. This is a classic book that writes the prequel to another classic book by a different authoress. And that is Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. Have you read this book? Wide Sargasso Sea is the prequel to none other than Jane Eyre, would you believe? Now, I'm only going to give you a short synopsis of this book, but if you've never read Jane Eyre, maybe just jump to the next book, because it's hard to not give a spoiler away about Jane Eyre when I'm telling you what this is about. So, a few seconds to pause or jump ahead. Okay, so Wide Sargasso Sea. Of course, Sargasso Sea in the Caribbean, so it's set in the sort of languid, gloriously heavy sunshine of the Caribbean. And we meet here a character called Antoinette Cosway, and she's a Creole heiress. Now she's affianced to an Englishman who is over there for a while by the name of Mr. Rochester. Now if you've read Jane Eyre, you've probably connected the dots now and you know who Antoinette Cosway is. She falls madly in love with Rochester, and he likewise, but then vicious rumours begin to circulate about something dark and sinister about Antoinette's personality, character, which begins to poison Rochester's mind against her. And again, if you've seen or read the book Jane Eyre, you have an inclination of what that might be. And it's a very clever idea by Jean Rhys, because in the book Jane Eyre, of course, we get part of Antoinette's story, but this gives her perspective on affairs between her and Mr. Rochester and how it all pans out. So that's Wide Sargasso Sea. Does that appeal to you? Have you read it? It's definitely a book that you would read after Jane Eyre, because otherwise this is a book that would sort of taint the message of Charlotte Bronte and her book. You would want to read this afterwards, even though it is the prequel. So there you go, Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. So let's just read the opening to the book. They say when trouble comes, close ranks, and so the white people did, but we were not in their ranks. The Jamaican ladies had never approved of my mother, because she pretty like pretty self, Christophine said. She was my father's second wife, far too young for him, they thought, and worse still, a Martinique girl. When I asked her why so few people came to see us, she told me that the road from Spanish Town to Colibri Estate, where we lived, was very bad, and the road repairing was now a thing of the past. My father, visitors, horses, feeling safe in bed, all belonged to the past. Quite a good opening, isn't it? Third in the book haul for this month is a book by an author who has one of the most beautiful ways with words. His ability to evoke description which touches on emotion at the same time. an almost personification of the surroundings that he describes. And that's F. Scott Fitzgerald. If you've read The Great Gatsby, you'll know what I mean. He's got a beautiful lyricism in his words. But this is the famous book, Tender is the Night. And as you can see here, I got it for 50p, which I was very chuffed about. So Tender is the Night is set down on the French Riviera just before the French Riviera, no, not just before, the French Riviera is just becoming a place for, you know, those who matter, for the upper crust to come and mix in, to party in, to put on the Ritz, as the phrase goes. And what you've got in this story is the story of Dick and Nicole Diver. And they go to the French Riviera and they're this fabulous couple. They are entertaining, they are intelligent, they're witty, they're the life and soul of the party. But that masks a problem. Dick has a weakness himself and Nicole has a terrible hidden secret. And this book just charts the course of their ever rocking towards an inevitable calamity in which both of them don't come off unscathed. One of them in particular doesn't. And it's just written in that wonderful way that Fitzgerald has got. That pathos amidst brilliance. That introspection amidst extrovert glitz and glamour. It's amazing. And what's so touching about this is Fitzgerald's last book, and you can tell, if you know anything about Fitzgerald and his own relationship with his wife Zelda, whom they loved each other immensely, you can see the semi-autobiographical nature of Dick and Nicole with Zelda and Fitzgerald. So it's quite touching in the sense that when you know their backstory, so you could read that on Wikipedia, for instance, when you read their backstory and their relationship, they themselves loved the glamour, they loved the razzmatazz, the parties, the champagne, and they were wild and free and careless, and everyone loved them. But they themselves suffered a tragedy. And I won't say what that tragedy is in their real life because it sort of hints at what comes in the book. Zelda herself said that this was such a sad book because the story was so beautifully written. And that is something you get with F. Scott Fitzgerald. His writing is just exquisite. Amongst the modern writers, one of the very best. America really produced some absolutely stunning modern day classic writers, and Fitzgerald's one of them. So that was number 3, Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'll just read the opening of it for you. On the pleasant shore of the French Riviera, about halfway between Marseille and the Italian border, stands a large, proud, rose-coloured hotel. Deferential palms cool its flushed facade, and before it stretches a short, dazzling beach. Lately, it has become a summer resort of notable and fashionable people. A decade ago, it was almost deserted after its English clientele went north in April. Now, many bungalows cluster near it, but when this story begins, only the cupolas of a dozen old villas rotted like water lilies among the massed pines between Gauss's Hôtel des Étrangers and Cannes, 5 miles away. That's how it starts. And I must admit, he does a description of the girl that arrives in the book shortly after this, which is just absolutely spectacular. He talks about the flush of her cheek being like that of a child who has come out of a hot bath. And that's just so vivid a description for the purity of youth. So, there you go. Tender is the Night, F. Scott Fitzgerald. 4th up is a book of short stories by none other than the great Irish writer James Joyce, and that is Dubliners. It's hard to really know what to say when you've got a book full of short stories, but what Joyce does, it's not your classic short stories where a beginning, a middle and the end. It's sort of a vignettes, a snapshot of emotion and the capture of a particular feeling that we all recognise. So amongst the short stories in this is the famous Araby. Now Araby tells the story of a young Irish lad. It's only about 8 or 9 pages long. He's a young Irish lad, and he describes how he plays in the streets of this cul-de-sac, and he pops in and out of this room where, not a room, a house where a priest has recently died. But they play until the late nights, and he has a crush on his friend's sister, who stands at the railings to call them in when the nights got too dark. And she talks to him this one time, and she mentions how she envies him because he gets to go with his uncle to some of the bazaars, the markets. And one of them is this Arabian bazaar called Araby. And she says, I wish I could go. And he says, well, I'll bring you something back. And it's just, in a couple of pages, you see him go to the bazaar, but he gets there late. And his struggle to find something for her. And pretty much nothing happens, but what it does is it will take you back to when you were very little and you had your first crush on someone, and those feelings were so intense and muddled up and you were so confused in the mind. It will just take you back to that moment. Remember your first crush when you were about 9 years old. That's what he does. And sort of what Joyce does with Dubliners is he starts from children, and then the middle section of short stories is more adolescence, and then the later one is sort of you've got into maturity. And it's just those little captures of how life affects us in the different stages, the triumvirate of life. Youth, boyhood, adolescence, adulthood. So yeah, Dubliners by James Joyce. I won't read any of this one. In fact, what I'll do is maybe on a Wednesday I'll read one of the short stories and put it onto this channel for you to just listen to if you've got 20 minutes spare. Okay, so that's the next one. James Joyce's Dubliners. The 5th book in our book haul of modern books was written by Albert Camus, or Camus. Now, you probably know Camus by the famous work, The Stranger. That's by far and away the most popular work, but this one is called The Plague. And Camus, of course, he was French, but he was French-Algerian. And this book takes place in the small city town of Oran. Oran is on the coast of Algeria. And it's set in the 1940s sometime. Now what happens is you have a doctor at the beginning of this book. And something's going wrong in the city. The rats are dying. But no one seems to notice that the rats are dying to start with. And then it does become apparent that lots of them are lying in the streets. And there's a worry that a plague may have started. So they gather all the rats together to cremate them. And actually it's gathering the rats together that kicks off the plague. And our doctor, who we start with, talks to another doctor, and they think a plague's already starting. Some people we know have started showing symptoms of being very, very ill, coughing, high fevers. And they try to warn the authorities, but the authorities are like, no, 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 it's not a human plague, it's just something that's affected the rats. And nothing's done, but soon it becomes apparent there is an outbreak of plague. And so the authorities try to do something. They try to lock people down. It's bizarrely familiar with COVID and how it's gone, obviously different because it's come from rats, but this idea of trying to control everything and lock everything down, but they can't stop it. And then the city is locked up. You're not allowed to travel. You can't use the telephone. You can only use the telegram because they want to keep the emergency lines open. Now, that's a really interesting an interesting book to look at when you consider what we're going through with COVID-19. But the response of the characters in the city is very interesting because this is broken into parts, this book. Once the city is locked down, you will get the reaction of different characters. some who want to get out, some who maybe were wanted by the police or were reprobates, but then how they use this situation to their advantage to even become wealthy. And the whole thing is a very interesting exploration of the psyche of being trapped, and it's set in the most mundane of places. The way he describes the city at the beginning is just brilliant for painting a backdrop. What some have said about Camus, or Camus, however you wish to pronounce it, what some have said about him, and this book in particular, is that it's symbolic, it's almost allegorical of the Nazi occupation of France, because Camus himself fought for the resistance against the Nazis, and some say that's what's depicted by this plague, the Nazis' plague. Everything is shut down, you are trapped in your city, everything is monitored by the Nazi regime being in France. So everyone's plagued and claustrophobic, and their response to it, getting out, not being able to communicate freely. And that's an interesting take on affairs. So yeah, there you go. Albert Camus's The Plague. Have you read it, or have you only ever read The Stranger, his more familiar one? Make a comment down below. I'll just read you the opening, because he's got a great way of writing, a great style. It says here, "The unusual events described in this chronicle occur in 1940 at Oran. Everyone agreed that, considering their somewhat extraordinary character, they were out of place there, for its ordinariness is what strikes one first about the town of Oran, which is merely a large French port on the Algerian coast, headquarters of the prefect of a French department. The town itself, let us admit, is ugly. It has a smug, placid air, and you need time to discover what it is that makes it different from so many business centres in other parts of the world. Now conjure up a picture, for instance, of a town without pigeons, without any trees or gardens, where you never hear the beat of wings or the rustle of leaves, a thoroughly negative place, in short. The seasons are discriminated only in the sky. All that tells you of spring's coming is the feel of the air, or the baskets of flowers brought in from the suburbs by hawkers. It's a spring cried in the marketplaces. During the summer, the sun bakes the houses bone dry, sprinkles our walls with greyish dust, and you have no option but to survive those days of fire indoors behind closed shutters. In autumn, on the other hand, we have deluges of mud. Only winter brings really pleasant weather." The Plague by Albert Camus. Last in our book haul is a phenomenally famous book by Somerset Maugham, and that is The Painted Veil. What can you say about The Painted Veil? Such a clever book. It has the potential when it starts off to be quite vivacious, but as it develops, there becomes this stultifying atmosphere. And what it follows, you have the sort of anti-heroine Kitty, and she's pretty when she's young, and she's released into society by her mother, hoping to get a good match. But she's too busy just having a good time. She doesn't want to tie herself down to any of the young fellows proposing marriage, and she gets to 25 years of age, and suddenly her younger sister is going to get married, and her younger sister is plain. She's not as pretty as Kitty was or is. And so Kitty hastens into a marriage with a chap called Walter Vane, who's a bacteriologist. Well, I mean, when you marry a bacteriologist in a book, you know, you're not exactly expecting fireworks to fly, are you? So he works for the British in Hong Kong, and they go out there to Hong Kong. And Kitty doesn't actually love him at all. In fact, she finds him insipid and boring, and she longs for the high society that she used to enjoy. And so she gets into an affair with an official called Townsend. And that's sort of where you start the book. And eventually, Walter will find out. This isn't giving much away, to be honest. Walter will find out, but he's such a soft and inept and shy character. He doesn't even approach her about it. And so she begins to resent him. She believes he must know. He must know. And she begins to hate him. And then he exacts the most extraordinary revenge. Instead of laying her open to a scandal, which she could choose, but she finds out that her lover on the side wants to reject her. He won't risk a scandal. He's married himself. He won't risk a scandal, so he won't stand by her like she expected. She thought it was all true love. Walter says, either you have an ignominious divorce, which will be public and ruin you, or you come from me from Hong Kong to China, where there is a cholera epidemic. And he, being a bacteriologist, he wants to go and help people. And so she goes with him. Now imagine this. This is Kitty. She loves parties. She loves society, activity. She's very self-centered, and now she's thrown amongst the poor of China in a cholera crisis. I mean, they live in this dank, dark, depressed state. And she watches how Walter helps people selflessly, how hard he works to find a cure for cholera, to treat people. She meets a bunch of nuns at a convent who themselves are sacrificing so that they can help others through this terrible epidemic, to care for the dying, to take care of the dead. And you see the effect that this has on Kitty herself, the way it alters her mind. But will she ever get rid of vanity? Will she ever become truly selfless? And what will happen to her and to Walter and to Townsend? That's what this book is about. And in typical Mormon fashion, it's wrote with such a skipping rhythm. He's very good, and the opening to this book is absolutely brilliant. I'm going to read you more than the first paragraph in this, not more than a page, because it's just absolutely gripping how it opens. And this will give you an idea of whether you want to read anything by Somerset Maugham, especially The Painted Veil. So here goes. Let's read the opening part of chapter 1, which itself is a very short chapter. Something to mention about this book, all of the chapters are very short. So an easy one for bedtime reading, where you can stop very quickly if you feel tired. So it says here, she gave a startled cry. "What's the matter?" he asked. Notwithstanding the darkness of the shuttered room, he saw her face on a sudden distraught with terror. Someone just tried the door. Well, perhaps it was the Amma, or one of the boys. An Amma, by the way, is a maid in the Far East. They never come at this time. They know I always sleep after tiffin. Who else could it be? Walter, she whispered, her lips trembling. She pointed to his shoes. He tried to put them on, but his nervousness, for her alarm was affecting him, made him clumsy, and besides, they were on the tight side. With a faint gasp of impatience, she gave him a shoehorn. She slipped into a kimono, and in her bare feet went over to her dressing table. Her hair was shingled, and with a comb she had repaired its disorder before he had laced his second shoe. She handed him his coat. "How shall I get out?" "You'd better wait a bit. I'll look out and see that it's all right." "It can't possibly be Walter. He doesn't leave the laboratory till 5. "Who is it then?" They spoke in whispers now. She was quaking. It occurred to him that in an emergency she would lose her head, and on a sudden he felt angry with her. If it wasn't safe, why the devil had she said it was? She caught her breath and put her hand on his arm. He followed the direction of her glance. They stood facing the windows that led out on the veranda. They were shuttered, and the shutters were bolted. They saw the white china knob of the handle slowly turn. They had heard no one walk along the veranda. It was terrifying to see that silent motion. A minute passed, and there was no sound. Then, with the ghastliness of the supernatural, in the same stealthy, noiseless, and horrifying manner, They saw the white china knob of the handle at the other window turn also. It was so frightening that Kitty, her nerves failing her, opened her mouth to scream, but seeing what she was going to do, he swiftly put his hand over it, and her cry was smothered in his fingers. How amazing is that? What brilliant, brilliant writing. It's so swift. Do you see what I mean by skipping? He doesn't belay the point. He's got an atmosphere, there's action. He describes the scene is set for you. We know we're in the Orient because she's put a kimono on. We know there's an affair going on. It's just brilliant writing. So there you go. The Painted Veil by Somerset Maugham. Have you read it? What did you think of it? Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this book haul of 6 modern classics. What are you reading this month? Let me know down below. Have you read any of these or anything else by the authors already mentioned? Until the next time we meet, I wish you joy in your reading.